Hey everyone, hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this one-day UVA virtual talk series. My name is Susan Lynch. I am the Associate Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. Today we are celebrating a century of women faculty at the University of Virginia. We are lucky to have Abby Palko, Director of UVA's Maxine Platzer-Lynn Women's Center, and Phyllis Leffler, Professor Emerita in the Corcoran Department of History, leading our discussion with a distinguished panel of faculty. I want to thank the Alumni Association and the Women's Centers for co-sponsoring this event. This program is part of Retold, celebrating the women of UVA. Special thanks also to the following units for their assistance in sharing this program with their constituents: the College Foundation, the School of Medicine, and the School of Law. If you have questions during the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box below. Please add your name and UVA affiliation to your question. I want to mention that this program is being recorded and will be posted in the Lifetime Learning podcast library on our website. So thank you again for joining us for this Lifetime Learning program. Abby will be leading us off and introducing our panel. So Abby, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Susan, for your introduction, and welcome to the audience at home who are joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am coming to you from the Women's Center here at UVA, so I am on the ancestral lands of the Monacan tribe. This afternoon, I am joined by 4 phenomenal faculty members. I want you to have the most time to listen to them, so I will offer just a brief introduction of each of them, and then we will jump right into today's program. Co-hosting with me today is Phyllis Leffler. Phyllis is Professor Emerita of History from the Corcoran Department of History. Our panel consists of, and I'm going to name them in alphabetical order, Sharon Hostler, Emerita Birdsong Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Virginia. Sharon arrived at UVA in 1965 and retired in 2016. Farzaneh Milani, the Raymond J. Nelson Professor and Chair of the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures, and the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Department. Dr. Milani, who joined the faculty in 1986, is still actively teaching and researching. And Mildred Robinson, the Henry L. and Grace Dougherty Charitable Foundation Professor of Law Emeritus. Professor Robinson joined the faculty in 1985 and just retired this past spring. In a moment, I will turn the microphone over to Professor Leffler, who will kick off today's program with a brief overview of UVA's history. Then I will spotlight a few women faculty members from the past century before we invite our panelists to share their reflections. Phyllis, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm really honored to be here today in the presence of 4 such powerful women leaders at UVA. Today, our focus is on women faculty, but as we honor their role at UVA, I think it's really important that we try to understand the context of the university through time and also of the university that they entered. So I'm going to offer very brief remarks about that context. As so many of you know, the university founded by Thomas Jefferson opened in 1825. But we have to ask the question, for whom did that university open? It was open. It was always considered to be a training ground for future leaders of this new American Republican experiment. From its beginning, it had a Southern and aristocratic flavor. From its beginning, there was no place for women at the university because Jefferson believed that this university was, Jefferson believed that women really lived in a different sphere than men. They inhabited a different sphere. Jefferson believed women's education should be oriented around the support of family needs so that women could develop their capacity as domestic caregivers. He believed it was important for women to establish habits of good taste. What would they have been in the early 19th century? Dancing, drawing, and music. No place at UVA early on for that. So there was long-term resistance to full educational opportunity for women. And when women students were accepted early on, and a few were, they were at various points not allowed to receive degrees, marginalized, and restricted to specific women's fields. The image of Mr. Jefferson's University has lingered. Many people still believe, I still hear it said, that women students did not enter before 1970, and that and scholars of the history of universities claimed that we, the University of Virginia, was one of the last, if not the last, public university to fully accept women. Only in 1972 was full gender equality reached through Title IX of the Higher Education Act. And the University of Virginia accepted women to all undergraduate programs, especially the College of Arts and Sciences, on a gender-blind basis. Yet there were women who found a path to enter the hallowed grounds of the university. Many people don't know that there were summer programs largely inhabited by women from the 1880s, that nurses began to come for certificate programs starting in 1901, that education students came starting in 1920, including those in professional and graduate programs like law, medicine, graduate physics, and there was a Board of Visitors Resolution in 1920 admitting women. So many women started to come in 1920 that we actually hired a full-time dean of women. And so obviously she must have had something to do. So beginning in 1970, though, women started to come in smaller numbers into the College of Arts and Sciences, and they immediately got involved in student publications and in leadership positions that were open to them. Throughout this whole time, there were extremely few women faculty who could serve as role models or mentors for this student population. Some of the people on today's program became those mentors for generations of students. In fact, all of the people on today's program became those kinds of mentors and role models. So today we especially hope to hear from them and learn more about their own experiences in changing the character of the university. Back to you, Abby.
Thank you, Phyllis, for that fascinating overview. It sets the stage for a brief look at some of the groundbreaking women who have taught at UVA before we hear from our panel. So I'm going to talk just briefly about some of the notable firsts and then a few other ways that women faculty have made a difference here at UVA before we turn to our panel. Charlotte Martin Mehring was the first superintendent of nursing at UVA, and she drafted the plan for the UVA Hospital School of Nursing, setting in motion that first way of women studying here at UVA. After earning her medical degree from UVA in 1926, Thelma Brumfield Dunn was named instructor and then promoted to assistant professor of bacteriology and pathology. Dr. Dunn was the first woman faculty member in the School of Medicine. Charlotte Kohler earned her master's and her PhD from UVA, graduating in 1936 as the first woman Phi Beta Kappa. In 1942, she was named managing editor of the Virginia Quarterly Review, and then in 1946, named editor. She was the first woman editor of the VQR, a role she served in for 3 decades. In the mid-century, Roy Beasley served as director of the University of Virginia Hospital School of Nursing and director of nursing services. She was the first woman professor at UVA to be granted emeritus status when she retired in 1969. Catherine Russell joined the faculty in the medical school in 1952 after earning her PhD in microbiology here. In 1974, she became the first woman full professor in the School of Medicine. In 1963, Doris Coleman Wilsdorf was offered a faculty position here at UVA as the first woman professor of engineering physics. She was the first woman to be named as a full professor outside the schools of medicine and nursing. Rita Dove was named U.S. Poet Laureate in 1993, the youngest ever named and the first African American to hold the position. She used this appointment to generate public interest in the literary arts, traveling widely and giving readings in a variety of venues. She currently holds the chair of Commonwealth Professor of English. Catherine Thornton, who earned her PhD in physics here at UVA, was selected by NASA in May of 1984. She is a veteran of 4 space flights, logging over 975 hours in space, including more than 21 hours of extravehicular activity, as the second American woman to walk in space and the first mother to do so. She retired from NASA in 1996 and joined the faculty at UVA, and now is Emerita Professor of Engineering. Among the faculty, we also have a number of change makers, including Gertrude Fraser, who was a 1985 graduate fellow of the Carter G. Woodson Institute Fellowship Program. Professor Fraser is an anthropologist and served as the principal investigator on the UVA Charge Grant, which aimed to boost the ranks of female faculty in the STEM fields and in social and behavioral sciences and the economics fields. Charlotte Patterson, who's professor in the Department of Psychology and in the Center for Children, Families, and the Law, became director of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality program in 2011. In 2019, she oversaw the successful petition for departmental status for Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and she served as the inaugural chair of the department. Deborah McDowell, the Alice Griffith Professor of English, has directed the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies since 2008. She oversaw the program or the Institute's successful petition for departmental status in 2019 and is serving as its inaugural chair. Women faculty members have also played an important role in preserving community history and connections, including Quadrina Harold, who's professor of African American and African Studies and History and department chair. Her research includes work on the history of Black student activism at UVA, and she's written, produced, and co-directed 8 short films with Kevin Everson. Karen Wood, who was a member of the Monacan tribe, earned her PhD in anthropology from UVA. She served as director of Virginia Indian programs at Virginia Humanities from 2007 until 2019 and advocated for an Indigenous Studies Center and program at UVA. Gail Starling Marshall earned her JD from the law school in 1968 before becoming the first full-time woman professor in the law school in 1969. She helped found the Legal Aid Justice Center in Charlottesville. And Jelaine Schmidt, professor of religious studies, co-leads a walking tour of Charlottesville and its Confederate monuments with Andrea Douglas, executive director of the Jefferson School of African American Heritage Center. In addition to their research and teaching, or perhaps because of and through it, a number of women faculty members have been named as influential mentors of UVA students, both those today and those who have graduated. When the Alumni Association recently held their virtual event Retold, a question about mentors popped up in the chat, and this observation on the screen was posted, reminding us that for all of the women we can point to, there were also huge gaps. I was not able to find a picture of Sybil Todd, but I did find these tributes to her influence recorded in the 1998 University of Alumni that Professor Leffler oversaw. Other women who have been singled out for their influential mentorship include Betty Norris. She's all the way on the right-hand side in that photo. Angela M. Davis, also known as our Angela Davis. Malathi Veeraraghavan, who sadly passed away earlier this spring. and Sylvia Terry. And now we will turn to our panel. So I'm going to pose the first question, and Dr. Hostler's going to take it first. What was UVA like when you arrived? How would you describe the environment you encountered?
Well, it was pristine. The lawn was green. The students had coats and ties. There was a lot of yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and y'all come. And there were rocking chairs along the lawn in front of the range. It was a quite unique experience to this gal from Vermont, actually, from way north. At the University of Virginia Hospital, it was an even stranger situation in July of 1965, because it was a quiet resistance, an actual silent, unspoken resistance to the mandated integration of the hospital that came from Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in July of that year, I was placed in the nursery. And I can assure you that the most indignant of the resistance was about the fact that Black and white women would labor side by side, and everything was done within these units to absolutely not comply with integration. And that was never spoken. I was in trouble repeatedly because I did not understand that I was taking a, quote, Black baby through the white women's ward and disturbing their rest, that I should walk around the outside. In the nursery, that was in the daytime, but every other night I was in the emergency room. And there I heard the most derogatory terms for Blacks, for the poor, for women, for children, the mentally ill and the physically disabled. And it was a time for me where the politeness of the yes ma'am and the no ma'am fell apart, where there was really inappropriate talk and inappropriate touch. That was probably the most difficult place for me during my first entry to UVA. I was asked repeatedly if I'd seen and met Mr. Jefferson on my way, and if I said no, they say, well, he may not yet recognize you from the north, but maybe tomorrow he'll greet you on the lawn.
Thank you, Dr. Hostler. Professor Robinson, what was UVA like when you arrived? How would you describe the environment you encountered?
Well, I came in 1984, initially as a visiting professor. Visiting professors come either to fill some kind of curricular need or on what we call a look-see visit. And Dean Richard Merrill, who was then leading the law school, made it very, very clear at the very first meeting that this was a look-see visit, that if they liked me and if I liked them, then the possibility of a longer term relationship was a very real one. So I really didn't think very much of it. I came from Florida State in Tallahassee, and I thought it was pretty exciting actually to be at a big law school like UVA, big in size as well as in reputation. So I was determined really to learn as much as I could from the experience, more so than thinking in terms of a longer term relationship. I would say that some of the hard work that Dr. Hostler alluded to had been done by that time, that the law school was by no means perfect, but it was in a different place than it certainly had been earlier, and that even I found Florida State when I first went there in 1972. I taught for 47 years before I finally retired last spring. And Dean Merrill was stellar. He fully deserved his reputation as a scholar and a gentleman. He was admired, he was respected, and he certainly treated me at all times with the utmost respect and was entirely receptive to my presence and to my professional development, my efforts at UVA. The school itself was quite large. It had 1,000 students, roughly, 1,000 undergraduate students, which made it one of the largest in the country. 1,000 practically all male, all white students. There were a handful of women, maybe 25% of the student body was women, a handful of Black students, I'd say 5 to 7%. Exact numbers elude me at present. The faculty was predominantly male and white, quite large faculty as one would expect, roughly 70 full-time resident faculty members. One woman at that point, Professor Lillian Bevere, who was a force of nature herself, but she was holding the fort down all by herself. Gail Marshall, whom has already been introduced, was not a member of the faculty at that time. And when I came on with one woman who was actually junior to me. She was assistant, I was associate. We both subsequently became full-time members of the resident faculty, but we were pretty much it. There was one other Black professor who had come the prior January. Now, there had been several other males who came and stayed a couple of years and then left, and I never really explored in depth the reasons for those fairly short tenures, but they were all fairly short-lived at the law school. But that was the environment that I found. The students who were present, primarily the African-American students, although there was certainly white support, agitated for greater diversity, both in the student body, on the faculty, as well as in the curriculum, so that the intellectual horizons could be expanded for everybody, not only for them. And it was a result of that, as well as the efforts of Professor Alex Johnson, who was the sole Black member then in residence, and Dean Merrill, who was, as I said, I think, completely committed to the idea of diversity. Through their efforts, I came as a visitor and then ultimately as a member of the resident faculty. The law school itself was actually quite attractive. There was a great deal of student enthusiasm for the program, for the school. They enjoyed it, and that made this law school unique. Believe me, that is not by any means a characterization of legal education in general. Student satisfaction was high, and alumni support for the program was then and still remains among the highest in the country. And that speaks well, I think, to the environment that my colleagues have managed to create here. It was a robust intellectual environment, which I found exciting. I saw the opportunity to learn a lot, and that in fact has been the case. I felt myself broaden significantly intellectually over the years. I still remember my very first workshop. That was a part of the rite of passage for anybody who became a member of the faculty. I think I may well have been the first Black presenter, female presenter certainly, at the law school. And it was in the old faculty lounge. The room was packed and there were people sitting on the floor. I don't think I've seen anything like that before or since. It was intimidating for about 5 minutes. Then I sort of got into the spirit of the thing and we actually enjoyed it for the most part. Ultimately, they did extend an offer to join the faculty and I accepted that enthusiastically in the spring of 1985, thus becoming a member of the resident faculty on a full-time basis in the fall of 1985. And I remained at the law school until my retirement in 2020. Through my period of residence as part of the faculty, I think that I've certainly been well treated. All of my course requests were met without question. I had research support to the extent that I needed it. My research was touted, and I was lucky enough to appear on the law school website more than once. I collaborated with colleagues, always had the support of colleagues in the work that I was attempting to do. And that, of course, was a very positive thing. So by and large, I think that I came into an environment that was ready to make change. There were changes made. It was not perfect. It remains imperfect. But I think then and now, there remains a determination to make the school as good a school as possible.
Thank you, Professor Robinson. And then Professor Milani, I'll pass it to you. What was UVA like when you arrived? How would you describe the environment you encountered?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Abby. I feel honored to be in the company of such luminaries at the University of Virginia. Abby, as you mentioned, I arrived here in Charlottesville in August of 1986. I came here in search of a job, but found a welcoming, sheltering home. As an immigrant, as an Iranian woman whose books are banned in her own country of birth, I do not take for granted the privilege of sharing my thoughts openly and freely in my adoptive country. This said, My journey at UVA has not always been a smooth ride. For instance, when I came up for tenure, my dossier for renewal and promotion was subjected to an unusually rigorous scrutiny. Some believed the field of Iranian women's studies was not worthy of tenure. One person wrote, and I quote, "Despite the real value of Milani's book manuscript, the topic of women writers does not count as a major theme in the study of Persian literature." He recommended against my tenure. I'm glad to report, then as now, Iranian women writers have been some of the most iconic figures in contemporary Iran. I would also like to acknowledge and to express my deep gratitude to the Dean of Arts and Sciences at the time, Raymond Nassim, who was a man of integrity and a visionary leader. At times, teaching was also challenging. I vividly recall the day in early spring of 1990 when I went to my class fully covered in a chador. I wanted to strip the veil of its symbolic stigma. I wanted to make a point that we needed to stop fetishizing the veil and go beyond mere appearances. I look forward to a provocative discussion. But as I entered the classroom, I confronted a wall of shocked silence. Half the class stared at me, while the other half could not bear to look at me. After a seemingly endless pause, I finally asked why everyone was so silent. No one was willing to volunteer an answer until one of the students mumbled, "You're scared. You might be carrying a gun under your veil." I was sure she was joking. To my chagrin, she was not. She was scared, and she was serious too. By donning the veil, I had ceased to be the teacher she knew so well. I had become the gun-toting stereotype of a menacing Muslim woman. Undoubtedly, UVA has changed a great deal since those days. In my view, the most significant and inspiring change can be observed in our students' increasing gender and global sensibilities. I find myself often surprised by what transpires in my classes these days. I rarely hear Islam or the veil associated with women's oppression, subordination, or violence. I rarely hear pitying, even if well-intentioned comments. Consider for a moment my current engagement course, a course titled, "Are We the Stories We Tell? Women, Islam, and Literature." The first day of class this spring, I asked my students, all entering first-year students, to share with the class the first 5 words that came to their mind when they heard Muslim women. words such as strong, hardworking, honorable, gifted with family values, were the words I heard over and over again. I know we live in a polarized and polarizing time, but I also know that it is at the intersection of opposites that marvels are created. Rainbows are born when sunlight and raindrops coexist. I'm hopeful that this increasing global and gender sensibilities of our students, our future leaders, will lead us to a more equitable world where diversity is celebrated, self-declared superiorities are rejected, and the full humanity of people is embraced regardless of faith, nationality, sexual identity, or gender. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Milani. And Professor Leffler is going to jump in now with some follow-up.
So we've heard from all three of you, both about the context when you came, and in some ways about the evolution of the university from the time that you first came. So I think some of this second question has been answered, but let me just ask sort of maybe a two-part question, and each of you can respond with where you think it's most important to go with this question. One of them would be, have you experienced actual discrimination yourself? And I think some of that has been addressed in some ways. And secondly, you know, in what ways have you been that catalyst for change? And I know each of you has, so I know there are important answers to this. How have each of you been a catalyst for change, or have been involved in the change that has occurred over the university from 1965, when Dr. Hostler came, to 1986 and beyond? And we'll start with Professor Milani.
Thank you, Phyllis. I would like to discuss women's studies, not only as a catalyst, but as an effective agent of change at our institution. As you know, women's studies as an academic discipline is young. Women's studies programs and departments were created in the US just a few generations ago. The first programs and departments were established in the mid-1970s. UVA, I'm glad to say, was not far behind. The history of women's studies at our institution is the inspiring story of students' activism, faculty devotion, and visionary leadership. It was actually on April 11, 1979, that a Cavalier Daily article titled "College to Offer Women's Studies" announced that after 2 years of planning, a women's studies program will become available to students. Preparation for the program the article announced, had started in fall of 1977 when 2,500 of our students, always at the forefront of social justice movement, signed a petition and called for a women's studies program. Jean Bigger of the sociology department became the coordinator of the certificate granting program. A year later, Sharon was asked to direct the program. Davy carried with impeccable passion and wisdom two connected but distinct responsibilities, that is outreach and teaching. The double charge, difficult enough at the beginning, became almost impossible to manage as the years passed. So in 1989, the Women's Center was created, which is currently being directed in the able hands of my colleague, Abby. And at the time, Davy was appointed as its director. Anne Lane, dear Anne Lane, a pioneer in the field of women's studies, was hired to direct the academic program. Anne Lane was a peerless advocate for women. She served as a great mentor to many women, including me. The total devotion that often animates a new system of thought continued to motivate those who taught and those who studied women and gender at UVA. Finally, in January of 2017, the Department of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies was created under the steady leadership of Charlotte Patterson. This passion, this fervor continues to lead our faculty and students to challenge and modify conventional academic structures and curricula. Our faculty and students continue to ask new questions, revise methods of inquiry, speak out for justice for all. They refuse to be uninvolved citizens of the university community we all love. They contribute significantly to advance equity. They make visible the invisible. They give voice to the unheard, and they advocate for the marginalized. It has been my good fortune to be a small part of this life-altering experience at our university. Although a lot remains to be done, we have also accomplished a great deal. It has been a privilege to contribute, even in a very small way, to the creation of a university environment which is more equitable for all. The road has been long and bumpy, but the journey has been quite rewarding and wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad you focused on women's studies and the Women's Center, because women in leadership positions have been so important in terms of helping to both create this. The catalyst might have come from students, but the leadership that has been the leadership of women faculty has been so important. And I know that you are very, very modest, but I'm sorry, I cannot let this moment go by without also acknowledging how your own presence and values have served as a real role model for change at the university. And no one has talked about your being the recipient of international awards for your work on Iranian women writers, and also the many roles that you have taken administratively at the university to represent those underrepresented fields. So I want to acknowledge that, even though you have not, in addition to your winning the Women of the Year award by Iranian Women Students Foundation. So thank you for your presence and your work. Okay, we're going to move now to our second speaker, who will be Sharon Hostler. Dr. Hostler, to you.
Okay. I would like to just answer first about the issue about discrimination, because I think that I do represent where we've come from. And I think it's important to put it on the table and to say that, you know, back in 1965, there were a lot of issues. There were superficial issues about what I wore, and I had to wear a skirt, and you couldn't wear pants and not scrubs. And the surgeons preferred that I wear white hose, the nurses preferred I wear. So we had lots of arguments about, you know, what actually went on in my body and where I was those 120 hours out of the 168 a week. But, you know, at that point, I wanted so badly to belong and to be part of the boys and to be successful, that these were small pieces. It was not until 1976, just to have it's clear in everyone's mind, where women started to apply overall to medical school and get in. So when we're talking about the late 60s, there are just not very many of us around. And there were issues of distinction and discrimination. And I came on the faculty in 1969. I was so excited, and I said, oh, thank you. I'd be delighted to do this. Dr. Thurman, my beloved mentor and chair. When I got home, my husband said, how much are you making? And I hadn't asked, which is, I think, quite typical even today. And I did find out, because I was in charge of the multi-million-dollar project from the federal government, that when I had to prepare the budget that fall, that I made $15,000 a year, that the dentists who worked for me made $20,000 a year, and that the newly hired physician I recruited was making $22,000 a year. So it took a while to learn how to do that. And of course, it had nothing to do with gender when it was brought up. And it just, well, and you know, I always got a salary correction the day before it was in the paper about what the salary equity starts. I loved it when the Daily Progress, this was in the very old days that they would publish the top and they do the bottom. So I always managed not to be at the bottom. So that was in 1969 at that salary negotiation, which, you know, that was a lesson to learn. In 1971, we were buying a house, and my husband, who was older and wiser, said, you know, it should be in your name. And we maintained two residents because he was traveling a great deal out of Washington and sometimes internationally. And so I went over because the university had a loan program for faculty buying their first house for 10% for the down payment. But the secretary, and this speaks to what happens with women on women, the secretary told me that there, you know, I clearly was fraudulent because we know that there are no women faculty at the School of Medicine. And that took an intervention from the beloved Dr. Birdsong to have that done. And I got my loan, but I found early on in the 70s, I mostly fought individually, but by 1980, I had the wisdom of having been invited to a few of the executive leadership conferences at Garden. And I understood a little bit about organizational behavior, and that women could do things on the side. We could get the women's room, or we could get pregnancy leave, but until our values were part of the culture, there wasn't going to be real change. And so Horniman gets a great vote for getting me to think differently about how the organization is structured. And Dr. Carolyn Brunner, who was my colleague in internal medicine, were being wise enough to know that we weren't just alone at the University of Virginia. There were 139 academic medical centers, and we should figure out what was happening in the other places. So we went in 1980, we made a trip to Washington to visit the AAMC and kind of explore what was going on, came back with some thoughts. So one of the things was, of course, that maybe women should be on search committees for leaders. And so in 1983, there was a search committee for the new dean, and there were no women, no people of color, no students. And so that was our first protest. And the result of that search was Bob Carey. And so Bob Carey then was petitioned with the idea that we needed to do a status of women report at the University of Virginia. And it took 2 years, but Bob gave us a committee, and it was a committee of men and women of good faith and basic science as well as clinical. And we did a national database. We looked at a group of 10 peer institutions identified by Bob Carey, and we did research here and a lot of qualitative. So it took us 2 years. We had no staff, we did it ourselves, and it was a 500-page report. When we finished, we presented it to the dean and to the chairs and with recommendations. And we thought the easiest to correct would be salary. The hardest to correct would be academic advancement. Well, and a year from that, we had a task force on changing and dissociating promotion and the award of tenure, which was done then in 1990 and made a huge difference for women's success. Once women were out of the department, they fared as well at the school-wide promotion and tenure committee. And from that going on, we maintained a presence. And I think that the catalyst has been about faculty development for both men and women, for establishing mentorship. And I was lucky enough to both have access at the dean's office in 2003 and then at the provost's office in 2007 to do these programs across grounds. And so one of the questions that came from the audience was, do we have mentorship and orientation for new female faculty? Yes, it was started in 2007. There have been all kinds of mentoring programs, but not anything that's been sustained or at the level of the provost's office. And that's been continued, including about chair development and getting people ready for and surviving and thriving in retirement. And so I think if you look at the provost website, you'll see the fact that there's faculty development as well for the life cycle of the academician. So I would just say, I have very eloquent colleagues, that I loved the university, but it took me a long time to understand that institutions don't love you back. And in fact, one needs to learn to love oneself if it's going to be successful and thriving both in the lab, on the ward, and at home. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. I know personally how you've involved yourself in these things and therefore become part of that catalyst for change. And you didn't even talk about your leadership at the Kluge Rehabilitation Center early on, or any of those other really important positions you've held here. So again, thank you. Thank you so much for all that you've done institutionally to move us along. And now let me turn to Dr. Mildred Robinson, Professor Robinson.
Thank you. Those are two great statements. I commend both of you. Very, very powerful. The discrimination, it's hard to speak to discrimination per se, because as I have said to my students who have come to me from time to time and asked whether I felt that I were treated differently because I am Black and a woman, I can only respond by saying, I don't know. I've never walked in anybody else's shoes. I've never been a white male. And so I have no idea, how the interaction differs. What do you think? And they would say that they thought that perhaps I was received differently, treated differently. The interactions, especially initially, may have been different between me and my students. And it has been my feeling really over the years that it's always taken me, I teach tax courses, by the way, which is also kind of odd because nationally, there aren't a lot of women who teach in the tax area in the nation's law schools. And so there is a ramping up period where you really have to sort of establish yourself in the classroom in order to take charge and to be the one in control. And it has been my perception over the years that that has inevitably happened. This is an entirely elective course in the law school. And so my position has been that any student who comes into my class knows what he or she is getting. They know that I'm a Black woman and whatever that means to them from that point forward. But inevitably, I've always had a couple of hotshots who come in saying they got to take down the professor. At first, I was a little bit intimidated by it, maybe. And then it got to be kind of a game to see how long it would take for that person to emerge and how long we would have to arm wrestle before they finally conceded that, yes, this was my class and I was going to run it the way I wanted to. So it got to be kind of a game, but it is tiring and it was inevitable. And after a while, I really asked myself why it was necessary. So from that perspective, I suppose I could say, yes, I have encountered some discrimination. Was it insurmountable? Was it disabling? No, ultimately it was not. But I think that it is significant that it has been ongoing. Nevertheless, I think that by and large, my teaching experience, my experience at the law school, as I said earlier, was a successful one. I had a blast teaching classes, and I think that I had no more unhappy classes than any of my colleagues. And that's an important lesson too, in and of itself. It's very easy to feel isolated, especially if you have the sense that things aren't going well. It's very hard not to take it personally. And that was one of the lessons that I had to learn, that I could not take it personally, that I had to talk with my colleagues. I had to find out how they were feeling, what they were experiencing. And it was instructive to learn that sometimes the classes that I didn't like, they also didn't like. Entire classes could have personalities and they could be good or ill. And sometimes there would be just a few people who could really make a very unhappy and pleasant environment for a larger group of people. And so that was important. So in that regard, I don't think my experience differed in any significant fashion from that of my colleagues. Now, having said that, I will say that one of the challenges that I really couldn't do it very much about personally beyond being a part of the atmosphere generally, being a part of the collegial effort, was to expand the academy so that there was greater diversity, particularly with regard to Black women. As I have said, I taught for 47 years before retiring. Over that 47 years, for most of those, for almost 30 of those years, I was the only Black woman on the faculty. Now you think about that. It wasn't that I was friendless or lonely or isolated from the ongoing life of the institution. It's just that I did not have a peer, a Black peer. And that does have an effect on you. That does affect your perspective at least a little bit. The years when I did have a Black colleague, we weren't necessarily bosom buddies, but there was a different sense by virtue of the fact that someone else was there and having some of the same experiences. And on the very worst days, you could go in and say, you know, this is what's happening to me. Tell me I'm not paranoid. Tell me I'm not crazy. Or if you think that there is something going on, tell me how you have coped with it and what you would, how you would react. That remains a challenge. Even at this point, Black women at the law school and in the academy, legal academy generally, are underrepresented. I have been fortunate enough to have support from women in other schools, and in comparing those experiences and in sharing those insights, I was able to learn, and I think by and large remain on an even keel. But I see my story in that regard as being incomplete to the extent that my presence has helped to facilitate greater diversity in the institution. It has not gone as deep or has been as long lasting as I would have hoped when I first went in as a very green neophyte in 1972. With regard to what I see happening in the university generally, law school generally, there are more women unquestionably in the student body. The percentage is now 50% for the first time ever, bringing UVA in line with the other major law schools. African-American population has been pretty stable, some would say stagnant. And I think that that remains a point of continued effort. The Asian American presence has been just astonishing. It has gone from practically invisible to now being a very large and visible body and a very important part of law school life. Other minorities are also present. I think importantly, the LGBTQ community is now open in presence and participation, and that certainly is very much in contrast to what was the case when I first came. The faculty, the African-American presence, as I said, waxes and wanes. We had as many as 6 2 years ago, 2 left to be deans. That's good news, but they left. That's bad news. One went to William & Mary, the other went to GW. Real kudos for the law school, but a real loss also. Presently, there's only 1 woman on the resident faculty and 2 males. So that needs continuing effort. It remains a robust intellectual community, I think a very attractive community, and I hope that that will be what's needed ultimately to get it over the hurdle, so to speak. With regard to what I've been able to do, I sort of boil this down to 3 Ps, if you will. Both in the law school and in the university general, and I say presence, first presence. Phyllis earlier talked about the role model function. I resisted that for a long time. I think perhaps as the first child, the only girl in my family, but my parents would say, you have to behave in a certain way or your brothers are gonna be badly behaved. So they're boys, what do you expect? But I think that there probably is something to the role model argument. And over the years, I've come to embrace it. I know I have had an influence on students, both in regard to just persuading them that tax law was something that was intellectually interesting and important and something that they should consider. And so I do have a number of students who've gone on to specialize in this area, Black, white, male, and female, and that's been tremendously satisfying. So in that regard, I think that it has been positive with regard to my effect on the lives of others. Participation in the law school generally, in university life, and for that matter, more broadly in the community, I think visibility is important and sends a message. And finally, perseverance. 35 years is a long time. Of course, I have to bow to Sharon. She's been around even longer than I have. But I think the willingness to hang in and to continue to work and to continue to press forward carries a message also. I know one of the buildings says roughly follow the truth wherever it may lead. That's what I've attempted to do. That's what the university, I think, has attempted to do, will continue to do. I think that there are challenges. Sometimes I feel there's more rather than less strife, that we're quicker rather than slower to take offense, that we're less likely to listen. But I think as long as we remain committed to following the truth and trying to do as much as possible to move forward, then there remains hope.
Thank you so much. I also want to make sure that we acknowledge the important role that you have played outside the university in the community at large, in terms of, you know, you're chairing the board of directors of Piedmont CASA and also the board of trustees on Martha Jefferson Hospital. You know, it's so important for women at the university, but women in general, to have that larger role in the community. And I know many others have as well. So I know our time is short. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn this back now to Abby for concluding remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all 4 of you. Phyllis, you did such a lovely job acknowledging the enormous contributions of our panelists. I just want to point out all of the work that you have done to recover and record the history of women here at UVA. Everything we've been able to do at the center is standing on the foundation that you laid. And so thank you for that. We are just about out of time, but it was fascinating. I've been trying to answer questions in the chat as they've been coming in, and there have been some wonderful acknowledgements of various women faculty members. So thank you for sharing that, everyone. Before I turn it back over to Susan, for like 30 seconds, 1 sentence, is there a last thought the 4 of you would like to share? Barriers still to be faced, or something that leaves you hopeful about the future?
Well, I think the hope is the 50% of the students who are women and men actually together in the School of Medicine, and personally my trainees who have gone whither and thon throughout and creating their own academic places, both in pediatrics and developmental medicine, but also as leaders for men and women. So that is our legacy, and our legacy is national and international because of our wonderful students. The best thing about the University of Virginia is the students.
Thank you, Dr. Hostler.
I think that's absolutely well said. I hope our students continue to drink as deeply as they have, as they can, from the veritable fountain of intellectual opportunity they have at the law school. It's so broad, it's so deep, and it can prepare them for, in so many ways, for the roles that they will take when they go out into the world.
Farzaneh or Phyllis, would you like to jump in?
Well, I'll just say on this 50th anniversary of the full admission of women students and the 100th anniversary of the resolution to admit women to the university, I am really, I feel deep admiration for the three colleagues who've spoken today. And I think the future of the university is in very, very good hands right now. So I am very optimistic about the capacity of the university now to really be all it can possibly be. And I want to thank Abby, especially for conceiving and designing this program so that we can get this conversation started. Thank you, Abby.
Thank you, Phyllis. I'm looking, okay. So at this point, I would just like to thank all four of you so much. This has been the most wonderful hour of my week. It was a true pleasure to listen to you. And Susan and I are going to be in conversation about ways that we can continue exploring your experiences and sharing these thoughts. So with that, I will turn it back over to Susan. Susan, thank you for the opportunity to present this panel.
Absolutely. I would just want to thank everyone on the panel. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Phyllis, and all of our panelists for their contribution to this wonderful event. We very much appreciate your insights into your time at UVA. You can see that our faculty are a key component of what makes UVA so very special. So Lifetime Learning's next event is on Friday, November 20th, with a program entitled Mounting Tensions Between China and India, What It Means for the United States and the World Order. Then our next one-day UVA virtual event is on Wednesday, December 2nd. We'll kick off holiday season crafting cocktails with UVA alum Michael Amon. So please join us for that. Please keep your eye out for those events and many others at our Lifetime Learning website, which can be found at alumni.virginia.edu/learn. You can register for all of our programs on this site. In the meantime, we want to thank you for being here. Please stay safe and be well and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.